Welcome to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today's show is going to be on the topic of boundaries in relationships. We're going to do it in three episodes of it. So the third episode will be on what to do when people violate the boundaries of a relationship. The second section will be on how we determine and create our boundaries. And today's topic is going to be on what do we mean by a boundary and why do we have them? Why do they make healthy relationships? And what are some of the misconceptions about boundaries? And finally, we're going to give some examples of boundaries in different situations.
Yeah.
So Marsha, why don't we start off with
what are
we talking about with a boundary?
No, I can't believe that we haven't touched on this topic before, because when we started preparing for this, I thought, wow, boundaries really do affect my life. And I've had trouble with boundaries over the course of my life as well. We should mention that some of our reflections today are based on the work of Sharon Martin's Better Boundaries workbook. And in this work, she states that boundaries are essential to our health, happiness, and success. And Tom, I don't think of boundaries immediately when I'm thinking about my health, my happiness, and success. I think more of like my diet. I think about my fitness level. I think about, am I eating well? Am I sleeping well? Am I exposing myself to toxins? And in terms of happiness, I think, what's my state of mind? Do I have the right skills and education? It could be about my opportunities and my networks, or even just luck. I don't think about boundaries, but as we got deeper into this and we're preparing, I totally get it, because they're a little invisible, but we know when they have been crossed.
Do we ever? Yes.
And what boundaries do is they give us a sense of self-determination in which we can make all of those decisions about diet, rest, how we spend our time, our pursuits, and with whom we're doing it.
Just a sense of security, I think, feeling okay about ourselves.
I think boundaries are mostly linked to things like security and fear and just our very existence. They seem far from it, but when we get talking about, it's safety, I think, what we're willing to do in relationship with others. And it describes our autonomy and our agency and who we are as separate people in the context of community. It's like, where is the me in we? And I don't think we talk about that enough.
But it can sure wreak havoc in a relationship when we aren't paying attention to it.
In whether it's a roommate, a sister or a brother, parent, child, life partner, workplace, a neighbor. If you've borrowed my chainsaw and you bring it back, but it's not working, I feel like you have you violated a boundary and an expectation. And actually, we wrestled with, what is the difference between expectation and boundaries? And I was thinking about that last night a little bit. And I think boundaries are the things that I set for myself, that I invite you or another person to understand and to respect. Expectations are more descriptions that I'm making about another, like somebody else. And although they're interrelated, I think they're slightly different. So some of the misconceptions that we have about boundaries is that they're demands. And again, I would like to say, and so did Sharon Martin in her work, that they are requests. They're an invitation for cooperation.
Sort of guidelines.
They're guidelines, and it's not meant to control another person. It's really just kind of a recipe for what I need. And they're not ultimatums. They're not, while a violation of a boundary could carry a consequence, they don't include threats. They don't include like last warnings. They're not ultimatums. They're, again, kind of a signpost. And they're not mean. I think that we hesitate to be explicit about what our boundaries are because we think that we're pushing people away, and that there's something unkind about boundaries, that it creates distance and conflict. But in fact, communicating those things up front or along the way in the context of your relationship can actually be an investment in the relationship, because you have boundaries whether you are talking about them or not. Mm-hmm. And when they are violated, when somebody oversteps that or disrespects it, you're going to have a reaction to that. You're going to trust less. There will be distance. So if we can talk about them and communicate them up front, it is, as I said, an investment. And they're not selfish. Some people think, well, if you want to have time to work out, but you don't want to have time to do something else with me. And that's awfully selfish of you to want to spend an hour on the treadmill or something like that. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. There's no shame, there's no blame, and I can ask for something that I need, and it doesn't necessarily prevent you from having what you need. You just need to kind of negotiate that. Mm-hmm. And they're not rigid and fixed. They can change. They can change as your relationship evolves. Mm-hmm.
It can be a source of bonding too, that when I understand your boundaries and I respect them, I honor them, then that creates a sense of appreciation from the other party that you're doing that, and that begins to feel in the form of love and caring, which
trust,
are the things.
I think.
Yes, and
trust.
It
it allows me to relax into a relationship, and I'm not on guard. I don't have to be protecting myself and worrying and not showing my vulnerability. We've talked about how vulnerability can be, that mortar for the connections that we're making with each other. I'm not going to be willing to be vulnerable in a relationship if I can't trust that you're going to understand and respect my boundaries. We may have a relationship, but it may not be as authentic and as deep and as rich as it could be if we talk about our boundaries and we respect each other's boundaries.
So let's go with, now that we understand a little bit about what boundaries are, let's start with some examples.
Some categories, because they're not only different kinds of boundaries, but they're different kinds of relationships too. So
let's start with one of the more complex of these relationships, and that is the relationship that we have with our life partner or spouse. And there are different boundaries that we'd like to identify with it, and then we'll get more specific in terms of examples. What would happen if they weren't respected and what needs to be in there as a boundary. So we're going to be talking with life partners about boundaries in faithfulness, boundaries in communication, boundaries in privacy, boundaries in money, boundaries with time, boundaries with household responsibilities, boundaries with parenting, and boundaries in sexual relations. So going back to the first of those, one in faithfulness, by that we're meaning that
kind of loyalty, right?
Yeah, we're putting the relationship first. It's a top priority, a high priority, and both parties know that, and their actions verify that.
I think this is a tough transition for in-laws and newlyweds, because couples need to pivot to that, where this new relationship that they've chosen and this new path really needs to be protected, and they need to be loyal to that. And sometimes that's a tough transition to do, coming from your other family of origin and navigating that.
Another transition I think that's difficult is when we have children, because it's very easy to become so enwrapped in children and working with them that we forget about the needs of the relationship. And the boundary there is broken, or the expectation, and therefore the relationship starts to suffer. So another limit that is important in a intimate relationship is the non-sexual connections of intimacy that we have with other people. That what is that boundary? For example, being at a party, say, and your spouse is talking with somebody else, and they're touching the person, they're being affectionate with the other person. Is that a boundary that's going too far in your relationship? Maybe someone is just naturally affectionate and touchy-feely type of thing. But when you see them using that behavior on someone else, that can create friction. So that boundary needs to be discussed and respected. Time spent. We've come across that a lot.
Big.
Not only with friends and relatives, but with career.
Career, hobbies, and with your friends and your other interests. That's hard to navigate.
That's right. When that takes over, that begins to create friction and conflict within the relationship. If that boundary is understood and appreciated, then usually people are expecting it and they know how to deal with it. Another one is attraction to others, or a type of flirting. Again, for some people, this is just the way they interact with other friends, other acquaintances they meet, but it might be a violation of the boundary for the other person in the relationship. Again, understanding that ahead of time can begin to help prevent that conflict from occurring. Discussing personal issues with other people outside of the relationship. And maybe the partner feels, hey, that's something that I wish you would talk with me. Or you hear sort of vicariously about a conversation that took place with your spouse with another person. You say, you've never talked to me about this. I feel kind of left out. So again, boundaries there are important to identify. And sharing information about your partner, that can really be tricky if you think you're just sharing something with a friend about your partner, but your partner is offended by the fact that you have talked about him or her and felt that that was something just between the two of you.
Right, and that happens in the other direction. If you're talking to a friend and sharing some personal information, and then you think it's just with you and your friend, but then because of the bond that the partnership that they share it with their life partner, and they're like, I thought that was just between the two of us.
Exactly.
So that kind of, that's an important boundary.
So the next area that we need in a life relationship is communication. Of course, a lot of these overlap, but in this one, sometimes we have affectionate words for each other that we use. And if you suddenly hear your partner using that term with someone else, it just takes away the meaning of it and can, again, for that person be a violation of what they understood that term meant. Also, we need boundaries on how to express anger and how to deal with disagreement. What are the ways that we agree we're going to do that? And of course, that's where we work a lot in mediation and in coaching to help people understand those skills. We've talked about this in the past, understanding the partner's love language.
Yeah.
What is the particular medium by which the person, your spouse, feels love and appreciation and caring? That's different for different people. If you understand that, then you can understand how to deal with those boundaries. Expectations about honesty and openness in the relationship. Very important.
It's almost like directness and indirectness,
Yes.
and being concrete and kind of implying, what is that level?
And showing respect for the other partner in social situations where you, again, would not want to hear that you've been talked about or demeaned in some way with it. And also supporting our partner when they've been mistreated by others, that we stand up for them, that we begin to show empathy and understanding for our partner with it. And another one that's so important, we often hear couples talk about, well, we've just grown apart. Well, that took some action to do that, or inaction.
It could have been a boundary
Well,
violation.
and that's the boundary of expectation, that to be open with what's going on. If to hear one partner say to the other, when did you start to feel this way? When did you start to think this way? Why didn't you share that? those are important boundaries, again, that understandings that the couple will have about, if you start to feel these way, you will share them with me and we will talk about them.
And sometimes a partner will share and it's not heard or it's not respected, it's diminished. And so
it changes the
it
boundary.
changes the boundaries. And I think when we're talking about boundaries, we're saying that having boundaries, respecting boundaries, being explicit with boundaries can help the relationship and it can build it. And if you don't, it may create problems. It's kind of cyclical though. So if you have problems in the relationship, you may be less likely to care about respecting somebody's boundaries. So, it's one of those cycles that we talk about. And at any point, you can choose to act differently.
Yes.
And it's through respecting boundaries that maybe you can restore or repair some of the previous harm, or asking about boundaries. They're kind of invisible, but they're kind of huge.
Well, and as you say, sometimes you don't think about them, but when they're violated, you certainly get a visceral feeling in your gut that something is wrong and something is bothering you.
And again, it's kind of like when we talk about different points of view. Sometimes we have an expectation, or people have an expectation that my boundaries should be everybody's boundaries, because that's just the way they are. But allowing for them to be flexible. For instance, I really don't like to be around violent entertainment, but I understand that other people like that kind of suspense and horror or violence in order to just be released. But people in my world understand that they're not going to do that around me, and because it hurts me. So it could be something just as small as that.
So another area within a life partner relationship is the privacy boundaries, and this gets tricky too.
It does get tricky because I think in some folks, when they come together and they make a commitment together, they feel like everything should be for everybody and that we have given up the me in the we and that everything is us.
Well, they've lost their individuality with it. And when we said at the beginning that the relationship has to take priority, it does not mean that it's at the expense
that you're
someone's individual identity.
Absorbed, and that you are an extension of that other person, or that you're totally eclipsed.
So we have to respect the fact that someone has an identity that's important to them outside of the relationship. And when that is supported by both parties with each other, it again can be a bonding experience, because they're not saying, well, you have to think the way I do, or act the way I do, or just participate in the activities that I'm interested in. We can do other things and feel comfortable with that and appreciate the other party's willingness to give us that space.
I think that the distinction between privacy and secrecy is important too.
Yes.
Because privacy is kind of a boundary, and allowing me to still have integrity as a human being, separate from somebody else.
With no intention to hurt the
hurt
other
or
party.
harm, and secrecy may have other intentions.
To keep something away from someone that could hurt them or harm them.
Right, unless it's a birthday surprise.
Then it's a surprise, not a secret.
But I think people don't think about that distinction of secrecy and privacy.
Money, certainly, we're well aware of how those boundaries need to be worked through in relationships. And I think they're fairly obvious how we're going to deal with our assets and income, decisions about spending, and the division and decision about that needs to be equitable in some way that we are okay. Sometimes one party will handle more of the finances than the other, but they're both comfortable with that. So if that boundary is discussed and respected, there should be no difficulty with it.
And again, do we have money that's ours, but do I have money and do you have money? Or,
right. Those are all part of that
discussion.
Right.
And we're not saying there's a particular right or wrong.
Time boundaries and expectations.
I think we talked a little bit about that earlier, about how we spend our time.
Spending time together, or time with friends, and on the job. Household responsibilities, fairly obvious, but it's amazing how even the influence in our society now is shifting that, although there still is evidence to show that much of the child care and so forth is still being assigned more to the female or one party than
And that's
the other.
a time thing. It goes back to that.
Sure. Parenting, how will the decisions about parenting, the consequences for children's behavior, and how will you raise the children? Obviously, those things really need to be talked about, and they're ongoing as the child's development changes. And finally, sex, that the when, where, how, in what way are we comfortable with it?
Consent.
Consent, the ability to say, I'm not wanting to do it now at this particular time. So those are all within boundaries of a couple working together. So let's go into boundaries that we might need
With children, yeah. So, and this is something that will change over time. And I think in one of our next episodes, we'll talk about how boundaries can be flexible and evolving. So boundaries with kids are serving two things. One is like safety, but also we are teaching the whole time how modeling about how they should later set boundaries for themselves, for their own self-care and for their own integrity. But initially it's about physical safety. And so we are providing guidance when they're very, very early. There's very little separation between us and them. But you're going to be different with a 5-year-old than you will with a 15-year-old. In terms of everything, in terms of food, in terms of privacy, in terms of the clothes they wear, how they spend their money, the bedtime, the friends. I'm choosing their friends initially because I'm setting up play dates, but later on they're choosing their own friends. They're choosing their own clothes. They're choosing their own food to a certain extent.
And the child will have boundaries of his or her own that you have to deal with.
Right, and even in terms of the care of their own body. And I think that this is a tricky one for parents and kids to talk about and to navigate, because as parents we kind of lag behind the clues that they're giving us, and we may be reluctant to move on to the next stage.
It's a difficult transition in parenting, isn't it?
We cherish the stage that they're in, and we're not really ready to go on.
Or know the skills for going on.
And we could have loose boundaries. Again, if we're thinking that it's unkind, we let them decide. They may not understand expectations and kind of be lost. And as they get older, if we have kept those rigid boundaries with harsh consequences, that can be devastating as well. And then we also have boundaries in the workplace in terms of it being safe, clarifying our roles, what I'm willing to actually do on behalf of an employer and what I don't want to do.
Stance and boundary in terms of fair assessment of my work. Boundaries when a colleague may take credit for my work or not include me. I've had situations where people working together supposedly as a team decided they didn't like the way one particular team member was behaving, and therefore they had a meeting outside of the knowledge of that one party, which it just sets up more conflict within the workplace.
And it could even be in terms of the tools and how the tools of whatever job you're doing are handled. And the rules about stuff. We have rules about stuff in all of these relationships with our,
what's
did
acceptable
you eat my lunch or did you, you left the car empty again? And it's about respect.
Yes.
So we have briefly tried to touch on the importance of boundaries, what they are, what they aren't, all of the categories that we could assert and design boundaries for, and different relationships. And as we go on in our next episode, we're going to be talking about how to design them and how to negotiate those, and then go on later to talk about how to communicate in the event that our boundaries have been violated, so that we can repair that and reinstate our boundaries. And we'll be touching on how we should be aware of honoring other people's boundaries too, because it's not always about other people. Sometimes we misstep. So we hope that you will join us for the ongoing conversation about boundaries, and we look forward to seeing you again on the Relationship Toolbox.